In this video, you're going to learn the diet that will help you reverse insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes in 3 months or less. Before we jump in, who am I? My name is Igor. I'm the author of the Amazon best-selling book called Type 2 Diabetes Reversal Secrets. In this video, we're going to cover what is insulin resistance in the first place, what causes it, as well as what are the symptoms of it. Then, we're going to cover the 3 most important nutritional factors in order of importance that will help you reverse insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, as well as 1 nutritional factor that is often talked about but is highly overrated. And finally, we'll finish off with a section about how to test for insulin resistance. So let's jump in. First of all, what is insulin resistance? Insulin resistance is when you are sitting at home, somebody is ringing your doorbell, but you don't hear the doorbell. Of course, you're not going to let them in your home. Same thing happens in the body. Insulin is a signal. It's a hormone that sends a signal to cells, muscle cells, liver cells, heart cells, fat cells, and so on, to open up your doors and let the sugar out of the blood and inside your cells. That's what insulin does. Now, when insulin resistance happens, it doesn't do that. In other words, the cells don't hear the message of insulin. And why might that be? Largely, it's a lifestyle condition. People will often say it's just because you're not exercising, it's just because you're not eating right. But there's actually more than one cause of insulin resistance. Here are 3 in no particular order. One cause is inflammation. When the body is inflamed, it also increases the resistance to the hormone insulin. And so the approach for this person will be to simultaneously test their inflammation status using tests such as high sensitivity CRP or hsCRP, C-reactive protein, and fibrinogen, and simultaneously test their blood sugar levels using the test we're going to learn about later in this video, so keep watching. So that's one possible reason, inflammation. That could precede insulin resistance. Reason number 2 is high cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and it's not just because you're under stress. Cortisol could be high for a multitude of reasons. But what does cortisol do? Cortisol is the antagonist to insulin. Insulin lowers blood sugar, cortisol raises blood sugar. And so if cortisol is persistently high, insulin comes out to try and lower it, but it just can't. It just keeps the blood sugar high. Because of that, insulin resistance develops. A third possible reason for insulin resistance is high cholesterol and triglycerides. We often know this as a trio: high cholesterol, high triglycerides, high blood sugar. But what causes what? It's actually a bi-directional relationship. Sometimes high blood sugar and insulin resistance precedes high cholesterol and high triglycerides. Sometimes it's the other way around. But why would that be? Why would high cholesterol and triglycerides sometimes precede insulin resistance? One study, linked in the description below, shows that it's actually protective of the heart. When cholesterol and triglycerides go up, high blood sugar is actually protective of the heart for mechanisms discussed in that study. So check that out in the description below. And these are just 3 possible mechanisms that explain why insulin resistance develops. It's not necessarily just a lifestyle thing. It can certainly be, but it's not the only possible reason. And there are others that I discuss in greater detail in my book. Now that you know what insulin resistance is and how it develops and how it leads to type 2 diabetes, let's talk about some of the symptoms of insulin resistance and how do you know you might have it. One is if you get tired after eating. Eating should just make you feel full, not tired, not energetic, just satisfied, just full. And so that's one symptom. Another symptom is increased thirst. The reason you get thirstier when you have insulin resistance is because the body is trying to dilute the blood sugar. If blood sugar is too high, the way to make it lower is A, live a better lifestyle, and B, is to increase the amount of water you have so that there is less of a concentration of sugar to, well, non-sugar component of blood, plasma. Another possible symptom of insulin resistance is darkened skin, especially around the neck. So if you put your head back and then you see an increased darkness at that fold, that's a possible sign of insulin resistance. It's not definitive, but it's a sign pointing in that direction. Another possible symptom of insulin resistance is frequent urination. Frequent thirst is one way to lower blood sugar levels. Frequent urination is another. So if you're urinating out the excess glucose, well, that can lower your glucose levels. And the fifth symptom of insulin resistance is numbness in the hands and feet. Now, this usually happens in undiagnosed diabetics who've been diabetics for way too long. This is something called peripheral neuropathy. And again, if you have this, you might already be a type 2 diabetic, which is good to test using the test we're going to talk about at the end of the video, so keep on watching. Now, let's talk about the diet that helps you reverse insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. The three most important nutritional factors when it comes to this are, number one, total calories, number two, total fiber, and number three, total carbohydrates. These are the three most impactful factors. Normalizing total calories has the potential to help you lower your HbA1c by about 4 to 5%. That's the most significant factor. Normalizing fiber intake, and we're going to talk about what it means to normalize, can lower your HbA1c as much as 2.5%. And then switching from a high-carb diet to a low-carb diet of the same calories can help you lower your HbA1c by 1.0%. There's also one fact that people frequently talk about that if you're wondering why am I not mentioning it, it's because it's overrated. We're going to talk about what that is right after this section. So let's break it down. Again, number one is calories, and they help you lower your A1C by as much as 4 to 5%. In one study, when calories were lowered, the blood sugar of diabetics reversed to normal in a matter of 20 weeks. In other words, it went from a range of 7.9 to 8.4% down to under 5.5. That's very, very powerful. They didn't restrict just carbohydrates, they restricted everything. In another study, what researchers did is they used a high carbohydrate diet, which is 75% of their carbs. That's super high in carbohydrates. But this high carb diet was low in calories. A number of participants in this study actually dropped their medications as well as insulin just as a result of following this diet, this high carbohydrate diet. In this diet, they actually ate 2,200 calories per day. And that's why even a high carb diet helped these participants drop their medications in many of the cases. Because when we say high carbohydrates are only relative to total calories. The definition of high carb is anything above 65% of your daily calories. Moderate carb is 40 to 65%, and low carb is below 40%. So imagine this. If you're eating a diet that is 4,000 calories per day, but it's low carb, so 40% of the calories are carb, that's 1,600 calories. However, if you're eating a high carb diet, 65%, that is only 2,000 calories, well, that's only 1,300 calories from carbs. So the absolute number of carbs is lower in our example in the high carb group than the low carb group. So again, total calories are king. Next, the queen is total fiber. Again, normalizing total fiber intake can actually help you lower your A1C by as much as 2.5%. And here's some research to back this up. In one study, participants were divided into two groups. One group had a moderate fiber intake, which is about 24 grams of fiber per day. The second group had a high fiber intake. They consumed 50 grams of fiber per day. The calories were equal between the two groups. The high fiber group actually had lower insulin requirements by 12% and lower blood sugar levels by 10% and lower triglyceride levels by 10.2% compared to the moderate fiber group. A second study compared people in three different conditions. The first condition is a normal fiber diet. They consumed about 14 grams of fiber per day, which is typical North American intake. A second group consumed 24 grams of fiber per day, and a third group consumed 34 grams of fiber per day. Everything else was equal. The calories were equal, the carbohydrates were equal, and the protein was equal. After 1 month, the group that was consuming 14 grams of fiber per day dropped their fasting blood glucose by 0.45 millimoles per liter. It's moderate, but not super impressive. The moderate fiber group that consumed 24 grams of fiber per day dropped their fasting blood glucose by 1.0 millimoles per liter. Now it's on par with typical medications. Finally, the high fiber group that consumed 34 grams of fiber per day dropped their fasting glucose by as much as 2.58 millimoles per liter. This is better than the best medications out there. So again, diabetics have higher fiber requirements compared to non-diabetics. And finally, there's carbohydrates. One meta-analysis showed that there was a better result with a low-carb diet than a high-carb diet of equal calories, both in terms of blood sugar levels, but as well as insulin levels. So even if blood sugar levels are the same or very close to the same, insulin levels are certainly lower on lower carbohydrate diets. It doesn't necessarily mean keto, although that could be. It's simply less than 40% of the total daily calories. So again, to sum up, the three most impactful factors are total calories that have the potential to lower your A1C by between 4 and 5%, total fiber, which has the potential to lower A1C by 2.5%, and total carbohydrates that have the potential to lower A1C by 1.0%. And if you're wondering, how many calories should I be getting? The answer is you take your target body weight and multiply that by 15. If you exercise, also add in the calories from exercise. So hypothetically speaking, if you want to weigh 150 pounds, 150 pounds times 15 equals 2,250. Assuming you don't exercise, that's the number of calories you should be eating per day. What about fiber? How much fiber should you be getting? The fiber content for a diabetic, for somebody with insulin resistance, should be between 17 and 20 grams per 1,000 calories. So if you do want to eat approximately 2,250 calories per day, your fiber intake should be somewhere between 34 and about 40 to 44 grams, somewhere in that range. That is the optimal fiber intake. And then a low carbohydrate diet will be less than 40% of your total intake. I filmed videos about all of these topics in past times, and if you want to check them out in the description below, you can certainly do so. Next, let's discuss about one of the most overrated topics when it comes to nutrition for diabetics and insulin resistance, and that is the glycemic index and the glycemic load. If you don't know what that is, the glycemic index is a measurement of the speed at which any given food raises blood sugar. So it measures speed, but not amount. So it could raise it quickly, but a small amount, or it could raise it very, very slowly, but a very large amount. And so the glycemic index is only based on 50 grams of a specific carbohydrate. So you can see the problem there. To get 50 grams of carbohydrates out of a watermelon, you have to eat a lot of watermelon. To get 50 grams of carbs out of bread, you don't need to eat very much bread, maybe just 1 or 2 slices. And so because of that, the glycemic load came into being. And it started taking the quantity of actual food into account. And so at first, people were talking about how it's important to eat foods that are low in the glycemic index. Foods that are high in the glycemic index are things like watermelons, things like carrots, but they're fruits and vegetables. They're pretty healthy for you, especially that you need to eat a lot of them in order to get 50 grams, and it's virtually impossible. And so the glycemic load came into being, which made more sense to people, but scientifically it didn't. There was one meta-analysis done that found a very, very, very minor superiority for a low glycemic load diet. That superiority is somewhere between 0% and 0.4%, mild to moderate, if any. And the reason that I think that it's highly, highly, highly overrated is because what is it that makes a food low or high on the glycemic load? Really, it's the fiber content. So if you're addressing fiber anyways, you don't really have to worry about the glycemic index and glycemic load. You can just throw it out the window. Don't worry about it. And so if you're wondering, how do I get the right number of calories without being hungry? The two most important factors for that are 1, protein, and 2, fiber. If you're wondering how much protein do I need, I have a special protein calculator on my website where you can input your specific variables, your age, your weight, so on, and it'll tell you how many grams of protein do you need, as well as the best protein sources for it. Next, let's talk about how to test if you have insulin resistance or not. The two most traditional tests are just fasting glucose as well as HbA1c, and they're good tests, but they're not complete tests. In another one of my videos, I discussed these upcoming tests in way greater detail, but briefly speaking, here they are. Fasting glucose is a snapshot in time. It's what is your blood sugar at the moment the needle hit your vein. It could have been lower or higher an hour ago, could have been lower or higher an hour from now. That's one test. Another test is HbA1c, also called glycated hemoglobin. What that tests for is the average blood sugar over the last 3 months, because hemoglobin is a protein living inside red blood cells that lives for about 90 days, hence why the average for the 3 months. So what's good about it is that it avoids fluctuations. So in other words, if at the time your fasting blood glucose was high or low, it doesn't really affect your 90-day period very much. But its upside is also its downside. it ignores what's called glycemic variability. In other words, the gap between the lowest blood sugars and the highest blood sugars. It's far better to have stable blood sugar that's high than have wild fluctuations from low to high. Healthy fasting blood sugar is about between 4.5 and 5.5 millimoles per liter. Healthy postprandial blood sugar, the highest blood sugar you should ever have in a day, is about 7.2 millimoles per liter. In other words, the gap between lowest and highest should be approximately 2.5, 2.7, somewhere there. That's a healthy variation. Problems happen when it goes higher or lower, but HbA1c doesn't look at that. So there's a different test that does look at something called glycemic variability, the gap between the lowest and the highest, and that's called glycomark. That's what it's designed to do. Another test, a fourth test, is what I call the stress test for blood sugar levels. We know the stress test for the heart, that's stepping on a treadmill, attaching an ECG, an electrocardiogram, and seeing how does your heart behave at different speeds and different inclines. Well, there's also a stress test for blood sugar levels, and that's called the OGTT, oral glucose tolerance test. The way that test is done is you have your blood sugar tested before, then you're given a solution of very, very, very pure glucose, very, very sweet. It's between 50 and 75 grams of pure glucose. After you drink it, you have your blood sugar drawn every 20 to 30 minutes for approximately a 2 to 3 hour period. What should happen is blood sugar should start to rise in a matter of about 15 to 30 minutes. It should peak around an hour to about 75 minutes, and then it should decline and return back to baseline after about 2 hours. That's a healthy response to the oral glucose tolerance test. So that's the fourth test. And finally, the fifth test is something called C-peptide. C-peptide is a measurement of fasting insulin. It's better than testing fasting insulin directly for reasons that I discussed in my video about the 5 most common diabetes tests that you need to know, linked in the description below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. It will help you learn when I publish more evidence-based, science-based videos about reversing insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. As well, it will help other type 2 diabetics learn good information about proper nutrition for their condition. Thank you and goodbye.